Welcome to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence. Join me as we venture beyond the mat into the fascinating intersections of yoga and health. Each episode brings you candid conversations with the visionary leaders and practitioners who are truly shaping this field, sharing their stories, insights, and the profound impact of yoga therapy in action. Hey, it's Michelle. Before we get into today's episode, I just wanted to bring up one thing. If you're enjoying This is Yoga Therapy, the best way to support the show is to like, subscribe, and review. Whether you're watching it on YouTube or listening on your commute, your engagement really helps us scale. So please take 10 seconds to hit that subscribe button or leave a review. It really makes a world of difference. Okay, let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to This is Yoga Therapy, folks. Today we're joined by a true pioneer and visionary who spent over 4 decades shaping the landscape of somatic psychology and mind-body medicine. Michael Lee is the founder of Phoenix Rising Yoga Therapy, which is an internationally acclaimed method established in 1986 that bridges the gap between classical yoga, depth psychology, and body-centered awareness. He's an author, a global educator, and a keynote speaker who's dedicated his life to teaching practitioners how to use the body as a direct gateway to emotional and mental liberation. And today we're going to dive deep into how the intersection of neuroscience and mindfulness and somatic presence can foster deep behavioral change, and how a yoga therapy relationship can unlock the profound wisdom already resting within the client. So Michael, it's such an absolute honor and pleasure to have you here today. We were just chatting for a few minutes. This is our first time meeting.
It is, and it's about time, and I'm really
Yeah,
pleased we're doing it today. Yeah.
me
Thank you for
too.
having me, Michelle. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So many of our listeners are deeply passionate about finding that sweet spot between clinical science and
Yeah.
somatic lineage. And long before yoga therapy was recognized by mainstream institutions, and in some places it's still not recognized, you were integrating Rogerian person-centered psychology with the physical practices of yoga. So looking back at your journey, how did your background in behavioral science and your roots in the lineage come together to form what we know as Phoenix Rising?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. It's really a great one. It was actually more accidental than deliberate. And I can tell you the story. There's a
Yeah.
story behind it. So I was teaching in a college and also I had an academic career, teaching and also consulting, did a lot of consulting work. And the consulting work was around organizational change, how people in organizations change. I was living in Australia, and at that time, a lot of organizations, including the public service, were looking at more up-to-date methods of how they were doing business and how they were relating and what kind of places they were creating as workspaces. And they wanted things to be a little more humanistic, a little more caring, a little more supportive, and hopefully a little more effective along the way as well. So I was tasked with a background in organizational psychology and organizational behavior. I was tasked with the job of supporting that change. And so we used to run these workshops, really great workshops based on a lot of the new material out of places like Tavistock, a lot of the thought leaders of the time in organizational psychology or psychology in general, like Carl Rogers. And we'd run these great workshops where we'd have people come in for a few days and they'd get very inspired. They'd go back to their roles in their workplace. And when we check in on them 5 or 6 months later, dismally report that a few things had changed, but not much. No big impacts, put it that way. But they still thought the workshops were great and really helped them. But it was more at a personal level, and they didn't really see much impact in their workplace. So I thought to myself, wow, this is interesting. Yeah, I thought, let's dive into this a little bit and explore. So had that question in mind, how do people really change? What really makes a difference? And at the same time, I'd begun a practice of yoga. So here I was every day before I went to work, I'd go through the practices, and I was practicing asana, meditation, and a contemplative practice. and it'd take me about an hour, and I'd do this pretty much faithfully every day. And my 8-year-old daughter was watching me one day, and she said, "Dad, I really like when you do that stuff." And I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Well, when you do that, you're not so grumpy." And it was just like it hit me, like, wow, she is seeing the change that this is having on me. Right? There's something going on here.
Mm-hmm.
I gotta go deeper here. So that really began a more in-depth study of yoga, and the more I dived into that, the more I could see that in the wisdom of the yogis, that really was about transformation. Wasn't really about postures. It wasn't really about breathing. They were techniques, but really what it was about was how do we fundamentally shift our way of being, you know?
Yeah.
And so I thought, wow, this has got promise. I want to find out more about it. It was about that time I had a sabbatical. I was due for one, so I wrote up. I got very bold and wrote up a proposal that I was going to go and immerse myself in the practice of yoga for a year or two, and see how that panned out in terms of my work. And it got approved, which really surprised me, but it did. And so I went and became a resident at the Kripalu ashram, as it was in those days. And it had just moved from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts, and I took up residence there. And it was then that I really got it, when I started to engage my own practices then at more depth. And I had a couple of experiences where I could really feel the change. I knew that there was an impact. And I thought, this is the way I want to take my work. And then
Mm-hmm.
one thing led to another. And of course, I went back to resign my job, tenured professorship, which was hard to do, but it was like there was something else calling me, that was more important. And so I listened to that voice and set about establishing, I looked at what were the things that really made a difference. And the more went into that, the more it was that it was an inside job. This wasn't something that you could teach people or tell people. And it wasn't even about the practices, because the practices were just vehicles to get to a place, not the end of, not a be all end all of themselves. Sure, they have impacts. It reduces your blood pressure, or it makes you, you know, a little more relaxed and calm. They're all great things. But the deeper part of it was that it really gets you to a place of awareness that you wouldn't otherwise get to. And then possibly accepting that awareness in such a way that you can use it as a vehicle for moving to another place. And that all happens on the inside. So the question became, how do I design a protocol that can facilitate that journey? And that's really what Phoenix Rising is, what it became. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Thanks for sharing that
It's a long
story.
story. I'm sorry if it took so
Well,
long.
not too bad. I'm sure it's longer than that. Thanks for that version. But I think it really helps set the stage of, where you were coming from, what you kind of stumbled upon, and
Yeah.
how you turned that into something that could be useful for us to learn from, right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
practice.
Yeah.
And so let's talk a little bit more details then. So when we look at standard commercialized yoga or even traditional allopathic medicine, there's often an emphasis on fixing a problem
Yeah.
from the outside in. You've already talked about this being an inside job. So in Phoenix Rising, you teach a radically different approach centered around deep, non-judgmental presence and dual-centered awareness. So you kind of
Right.
understood it was a inside job, but now you're giving it some legs,
Yeah.
if you will, right? And so from a therapeutic standpoint, why is the relationship between the therapist and the client's present moment experience so essential for true long-term growth? So
Yeah.
there's
Well,
something
yeah.
happening not only in the individual, but in the
In
relationship.
relationship,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So, in order to take that deeper journey, uh, the yogis could do it on their own. They could go off and go to a cave and, take a few years out of their lives and engage the practices, and they would eventually get, to those deeper levels. What I discovered, which was probably because of the different world that we lived in, that it was actually possible and even maybe better to have a guide, to have someone who could be there and support that journey. And it actually made it easier. It facilitated it, right? As long as it was a facilitated journey and not an imposed one. So how do we get to that? Well, first of all, the relationship between the practitioner and the client is essential, because basically part of the therapist's job is to create the safety, to create the safe container where the client can feel free to engage those deeper parts of themselves that can be a little scary along the way. However, the interesting thing is they're less scary, and probably not even scary at all, if we remain present-centered. It's only when we get into story or stuff about the past or projections about the future that the scariness arises, right? So as long as we're maintaining present-centered focus, then it isn't so scary, right? So that was one important piece. And of course, it's tough to ask someone to keep to work towards keeping another in that present center of awareness if they've never really been there themselves. So it's really important that the practitioner, the therapist, has a really good experience themselves of what that's like, and is really adept at engaging it and really adept at facilitating it, right? And it's not really rocket science, because the 8 limbs of yoga pretty much spell it out, right? You take care of the personal life details in the first and second limbs, and then in the third and fourth, you engage body practices like moving your body and breathing that really help you become more present. That's really what the purpose of it is, to become more present, right?
Mhm.
And once you become more present, you can then cross the bridge into deeper layers of awareness, pratyahara, right? Crossing the bridge. And then in those deeper places, you engage concentrated meditation, right? And maybe even insight, samadhi, right? And so we all have that capacity, I believe. I used to think it was, some yoga traditions are about the more dual process, where it's like that's only reserved for certain people and you only get there after a lot of work and so on and so on. My belief is more and more that we're all enlightened now. We've all got it right here, right now.
Mm.
All we have to do is know how to access it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so it's possible with skillful training and skillful personal work, because the personal work's really important for a yoga therapist to be able to guide someone through those stages of yoga to a place of insight and awareness. And in that place of insight and awareness, particularly present centered, it's pretty clear about how it applies to their life. Right? Now, when they come back to just normal awareness, normal waking awareness, and more conversation, where now the mind is becoming more engaged, it's fine for the story to emerge. We've all got a story, and the stories are helpful. They're not harmful necessarily if they can facilitate change. But now they have material from within, insight, to apply to that story. So it's not just like in therapy, you hear about people telling the same story over and over and over again, and no change happens, right?
Mhm.
Well, in the yoga therapy world, in what I'm advocating here, is that isn't the case. There will be change, because there's insight that applies to the story that now makes a lot more sense, and is just a natural. It's almost like a natural evolution. Why would I want to stay that way when I've experienced, not just thought about, not just been told about, I've actually experienced in my body what it's like to be liberated? Why wouldn't I want to go there? You know?
Mhm.
And this is particularly true in the case of trauma, like people who've suffered from, some kind of event that's really left them in that state. Part of the therapy model for pretty much a lot of trauma therapies is to create the safety to be present to yourself now, right? And so this is a beautiful way to do that. But not only that, it you get to experience yourself not as the story, but as something else.
Mhm.
And then as a choice, it's just a choice. Which which person do I want to live in? Uh,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
it's pretty simple. So
Yeah. Simple and maybe not necessarily an everyday thing for folks, right?
no,
Because
it's
we
not.
spend
No,
so
no.
much time in our normal waking awareness,
Sure.
and having someone skilled to bring you to present-centered focus, that could be the first time that's ever happened, and probably is for a lot of people, I
For a
would
lot of people,
imagine.
that is true. Now,
Yeah.
not everyone might get there on the first try either.
Good point.
It's not necessarily a one and done, or there are people who aren't really that in touch with their bodies.
Mhm.
So we might spend considerable time just supporting that readiness to engage the body as the vehicle for the journey. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
And for
Yeah.
some people, that can take a little while.
Absolutely. I think about myself as a new yoga practitioner, right? It was the first
Right.
time I really even felt embodied, and
Right.
it took years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your book, Yoga Therapy and Integrative Medicine. You've got a couple books, and we're going to talk about
That
both of
one's
them.
someone else's book, but I have a chapter in it. Yes.
Ah, okay. Thanks for clarifying it. Well, in that book, you look at how yoga therapy interfaces with modern mental health. And I know that a lot of mental health professionals have been drawn to Phoenix Rising, yoga therapy in particular, right? And the methods there. And so, for a mental health clinician or a yoga teacher listening today who wants to bring body centered awareness into their work but feels a little intimidated by the scope of practice or psychological depth, what am I getting myself into here? I might not be a therapist, right? What's the first step in shifting from a mindset of trying to fix the client
Yeah.
to heart centered accompaniment? And I feel like, this comes up a lot in yoga therapy training because we are there so intimately with our clients who have experienced so much, right? And we're not, unless we are licensed in another profession, we're not mental health therapists. So, like, what's the first step there on this little journey that we talked about to just
Yeah.
being there in heart centered accompaniment?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned previously how important the safety piece is, and it is. And in
Mhm.
order to facilitate that, um, I know for me personally, I need to trust the process. And in order to trust the process, I need to have experienced it.
Mm.
So I need to have dived deeply into my own practice and into my own personal growth to some extent,
Mm.
to the extent at least where I'm trying to support someone else. Yeah. Um, And what does that mean? Well, it means by first of all, uh, coming home to my body. I need to, the body's the vehicle for this kind of therapy. If it's not the voice, it's not the mouth, it's not words. Words,
Mhm.
that's not the vehicle. It's the body,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So if I'm going to use the body as a tool, and if I were a tradesperson, I'd have good tools and I'd know how to use them, right? So it's essential, I would say, for any yoga therapist using this kind of a method based on yoga therapy. It's important that you come home to yourself through your body and do it regularly and get to know it well, and also get to know where it can take you when you let yourself drop into the deeper practices. And so a lot of practice, a lot of and a lot of reflection as well. There's a contemplative piece to this. How does this apply to your life? When you engage your practice in the morning, where does it leave you? And if you take a moment just to listen on the inside, what do you learn about yourself and how you want to show up in life today? And how can that make a difference to you and to the others that you connect with? And so they're all important skills that you know how to use for yourself before you start to try to apply them to someone else.
Yeah. I mean, it's really fundamental to the work of a yoga therapist, right? Is to have your own practice and to do your own work first. That's the only way that we can show up and be with others. There's no shortcut. And I think it's one of the things that makes this such a unique field, really, is the practitioner is also the client. As well, and has to be first
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
foremost. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in your recent book, Turn Stress into Bliss, Life-Changing Strategies for Finding Meaning and Fulfillment, that's the full title, you hit right at the heart of what so many people are struggling with today, right? And, I think so many of the things that have kind of plagued society have been true for a long time and remain true. But today, especially, there is unprecedented levels of burnout, right? And
Mm,
chronic stress. And
mm.
we know how prevalent stress is underlying to so many chronic illnesses. So in the book, you map out an explicit strategies to help people move from a state of constant survival into a state of deep meaning, right? And maybe they're like on the same continuum. I don't know. But from a yoga perspective, how do we practically begin to flip that internal switch and move from the
Yeah,
modern
yeah.
epidemic of stress into embodied bliss? I mean, you're that's a bold
It's
statement,
a bold
turning
statement. Yeah,
stress into
yeah.
bliss. I want to hear.
Yeah, I looked at that promise and I thought, is this really true? And you know, when I look at it, no, I don't live in a state of bliss, and I don't, and you know, my clients don't live in a state of bliss either. But it sure is hell a nice place to visit, and the more frequently we can do that, the better, right?
Hey, that's a great way to think about it, because
And
it makes it a little less intimidating too.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think
and
we all
so
have had moments of bliss and awe. So maybe
right.
that's what we're talking about,
And
right?
once you've experienced it a little bit, you know when you haven't got it, and it makes you take a little bit more notice about, well, what's going on here that I need to take a look at, you know?
And I think once you've had an experience, it's almost like you know that it's yours inherently.
Exactly.
It's your
Yeah. Yeah.
inherent state. It's your birthright,
Right.
right?
Right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. We're not meant
Mm.
to live like, you know, in a state of crazy frenzy. That's just not, you know, even the primates and the, you know, the in the animal kingdom, uh, animals who live like that don't last. You know, you don't survive.
Mm.
It's not,
Mm-hmm.
it's not good for you.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
So I think the big key here is awareness, like being aware enough that you're willing to stop and take notice of what's happening, right? And so many of us skip that. That's the switch, if you like. You talked about a switch. I think that's the switch. Stopping long enough to notice what's happening and be willing to say, yes, this is happening. Right? It's that simple, but
Mm-hmm.
so often we don't. Like it's
You
to the next
bypass it.
thing,
Yeah.
to the next thing. And then what do we do to stop the little bit of pain or the signals that our body and mind might be sending us to say this doesn't feel right? We we get rid of them. We use all kinds of products that are out there on the market to take away anything that doesn't feel good, right? Or we try to apply some quick fix that is supposed to make a difference, but without us doing anything other than being the same and keeping on pedaling just as fast. It's supposed to make it easier to cope with all of that. Well,
Mm-hmm.
maybe not. You know, maybe you got to stop and really listen to what's going on and take some agency about, okay, this is, but before you even do that, before you get to the doing stage, the first thing is to sit in awareness and then go to the next level, which is acceptance. Now, acceptance doesn't mean you're stuck with it. Acceptance doesn't mean to say, oh, I got this and I just got to put up with it. Not at all. It means there's something going on here. I'm aware of it. I'm sitting with it long enough to fully understand it, right? To fully get what's going on, right? And once I've accepted that that's the reality of my life, that's what's true, then now I can make choices. How do I want to be with that? How might I want to change that? How might I want things to be different? And then whatever practices I'm going to engage have a purpose. So I'm not practicing so I can stuff the stress and get on with my life. I'm practicing now to understand it more deeply, to feel it more fully even, and to then notice what the little shifts are that I can make. Like when I take a deep breath and I really let that breath just fall out, something happens in my body and it feels better. Wow, what would it be like if I did that? For starters, at the beginning of every day, and then sometime throughout the day, a few times here and there, right? What would it be like if I really paid attention to what my body's telling me? When I get that tension in the back of my neck around early afternoon or before midday for some, there's something going on. What is it? What if I just pay attention to that? But instead of pretending it's not there, what if I just stopped and felt that and really embraced the sensation that was there and asked it to help me find a way to be with that, or to what does it need from me? Might even, if we're really listening, it might be get up and walk outside, do some breathing, open your arms, look up at the sky, walk around the block, do something, just move and move out of this situation that you're in that's creating this. Take that break.
Mm.
And that way things and after a while people notice things shift, and they notice things shift to such an extent that it's like, okay, if there are external circumstances that are contributing to all this, maybe it's time I change to another set of circumstances.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe it's time I got a different job, or maybe it's time I took a vacation or whatever.
Mhm.
So it's doable, but it's an inside job, and it's based on awareness, and it's based on being with what is, not trying to pretend that what is not there, or that what is something that can be erased or eradicated by taking some medication, or practicing something that doesn't really engage our inner being. Yeah.
Reminds me of the Viktor Frankl quote, right? About between stimulus and response,
Yes.
in that moment where you can
Yeah.
pause and choose, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
discern. And
Right.
with the wisdom of the yoga practices at our disposal, like then that choice could be the deployment of tools that are really helpful
Exactly.
for
Yeah, yeah,
us.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You reminded me too of a great Carl Rogers quote on that.
Mm.
It's around acceptance, right? When I
Mhm.
accepted myself as I was, then I was free to change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
beautiful.
big piece of it is acceptance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, being
Yeah.
aware, first of all, knowing what's going on, and then accepting that. And in reference my book, Turn Stress into Bliss, I go through there's actually 8 limbs. You got to get your bodies first. That's first and foremost. That's the basis, right? Got to come home to your body. Then there's awareness. Like when you use your body as the tool, what does it help you become aware of? What do you become aware of? And there's different types of awareness. We talk about that. And then acceptance, like I said, it's not just putting up with something. It's like being with something present enough to know what it is before you choose to move on. Oftentimes in our Western world, we're wanting to move on to the solution before we've even known what the problem is, right? And so sit with it.
Oftentimes.
Yeah, oftentimes, right.
I'm
So
pointing at
sit with it.
myself here. Yeah.
Yeah. And then
Uh-huh.
there's choice. So
Okay.
the fourth one's choice. And
Got
then
it.
following choice, we've got discernment, because not all two things are alike, right? There might be one situation where it's appropriate for a certain response, but there might be another situation where that same response wouldn't be appropriate. So practicing discernment, and that's something that you know they don't teach discernment in schools. Well, they haven't. They didn't when I was there. Maybe they do today.
I doubt
Uh,
it.
so learning how to discern, and that creates wisdom. Of course, discernment and wisdom are very much alike.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get in touch with truth, because what's true for you and what's true for me might be two different things. You know, you might be able to, run 100 miles and feel fine. And that's not in my wheelhouse. Yeah. So I've got to accept that truth. And as I get older, I'm, more and more getting in touch with some of those truths.
Of
Yeah.
course. Yeah.
Like particularly at a physical limitations, but there's also truth at another level as well, like, uh, preferences and lifestyle. And also, if you get fine tuned enough in a spiritual sense, dharma. What's my dharma? What am I here for? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What's my life purpose?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then putting that into action, of course. And then finally, the last branch is flow, where you can engage that concept or state that uh, Mahaley wrote about in his book on flow, which is a really beautiful concept. It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
when everything comes together,
Mm-hmm.
and you only need a few moments of that to know that bliss is possible. Yeah, I can actually
Mm-hmm.
create this state. Yeah.
How are you differentiating between flow and bliss? Are they the same or are they
It
different?
flow is the expression of it, basically.
Okay.
The inner experience is bliss, but
I
then flow is
see.
the
Is the
manifestation.
state. I see.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Cool. That's really a beautiful blueprint, if you will, right? Nice little map or progression of
Yeah, yeah.
steps.
It came to me when we were training facilitators to run a group, and they were saying, well, there's got to be themes that we can have to focus each week of the group on. And I looked at my own experience. I looked at the experiences that I'd had with clients, and just in reflecting on that, I came up with those eight themes or branches that
Mm-hmm. That's
seemed to
great.
fit. Seemed to
Yeah.
fit. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being such an extraordinary pioneer for over 40 years and continuing to champion the healing power of yoga. You know, what I heard you say over and over again really was how the body's the vehicle and the yoga practices are so instrumental to this path of self-discovery, right? And I just love to hear a little bit about what your yoga practice looks like. I always
Yeah.
ask that at the end of the
Yeah, no,
podcast. And, you know, we've already had the recognition how important it is to
it
have your own
is. Yeah,
practice first.
absolutely.
And we've also had the conversation about aging because we're all aging
Right.
and our practice does not need to look the same today as it did yesterday or 10, 15, 40 years ago. So
Yeah.
what is your practice today?
Yeah, so I think I'm at a place now where I've got the luxury of being able to apply it to
Yeah.
different ways, different
Mm-hmm.
tools, different things that I might engage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Different engagements. And so, but there are fundamentally things that are important. The fundamentals are that the body's engaged, the breath is engaged, moving is engaged, right? And coming to a place of focus is really important, right? Um, and so, in a yoga posture, for example, we use the concept of the edge, where you go to that place of not too much, not too little, and that becomes a place of focus. And so, building that in somehow is important. But there's many different ways you can do that. For example, one of the things I love to do this time of year is go out in my kayak, so I can actually paddle in a rhythmic way to breathing. So it might be 3 paddles to the in breath and 4 to the out breath, and I can do that for 10, 15 minutes. And then I can feel it. I can become fully connected to my body and engaged, breathing and moving, right? And then I might sit for a little while and just, allow everything to settle. Or I might, if I want to, I want to engage that edge. I might start to paddle really fast and get to that point of almost too much, but not quite. And a rate at which I can continue for maybe 5 minutes where I'm not overly stressed, but I've definitely got an awareness that I'm working, there's effort involved. And then sit in the stillness of that for a while, right? And then I usually do a meditation, 10, 15, 20 minutes sometimes more. And then I think the important piece is the end of the meditation, looking for the insight. And that's not what I think, it's more from a felt sense. So, from a felt sense, what's really true for me today? And I might ask a different question. It might be, how do I want to show up in my life today? Or how do I want to bring more love to my relationships today? And I have, a list of favorite questions that I like to ask myself, depending on the mood or the day or what's going on in my life. And that informs my actions for the day. And then, I'll spend a little time at the end of each day in reflection, like how did the day work out? How might I want to show up differently tomorrow? Or, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
And so,
beautiful.
and sometimes that'll be a yoga practice, a formal yoga practice. Sometimes it will be I usually do some kind of formal sitting meditation every day. Um, and I often also, from a Buddhist perspective, anyone who's practicing in that path, I've been engaging that path now for quite a number of years. I look at the Eightfold Path as well, like, wise intent, wise mindfulness, wise concentration, wise speech, wise action, um, wise livelihood, or whatever. And I might look at which area of that
Mm-hmm.
aspect of life do I might I want to be engaging today. How can I speak more kindly to the people who's crossed my path today?
Mm-hmm. So wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing and giving that insight. I've been thinking a lot about focus. You mentioned coming to a place of focus in your
Yeah.
practice or in your day, right? Because they're so intertwined. And, you know, um, just what an important skill that is to have as a human right now, too, with the level of distraction that is around us
Oh yeah.
now.
Oh yeah.
So,
Yeah.
thanks for reminding us how important that is. Yeah,
Yeah.
in the
Thank
midst of
you. Yeah.
everything
And
else.
I totally agree with what you just said. Right now, particularly, it's very important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the good news is, like, yoga's got lots of ways in which to hone that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I'll share the links in the show notes so that folks can dive deeper into your books, your classes, upcoming events, and all the things that you do. But it was wonderful
Wonderful.
to have you here today. Thanks so much.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks again for listening. If you're interested to learn more about who we are and what we do, check us out at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.